The photographs taken by the crew of another aircraft flying alongside her that day look like something a model builder created to illustrate what a structural failure looks like. Except the plane in the photographs is still flying. There is a category of event in aviation history that engineers study not to understand how it happened, but to understand why it did not end the way the physics said it should. The All-American belongs permanently in that category. Not because of what struck her on the morning of February 1st, 1943, over the desert skies of North Africa, but because of what she did afterward. The 97th Bombardment Group was one of the most experienced American heavy bomber units operating in the North African theater by the beginning of 1943. They had been flying B-17 flying fortresses since the earliest months of American involvement in the European War, a group that had participated in the first American heavy bomber raid on Europe in August 1942, flying from England against railroad marshalling yards in Rouen, France, before the entire theater of operations shifted with the Allied invasion of North Africa in November of the same year. By February 1943, they were based in the desert of Algeria, flying missions against German and Italian targets across North Africa in support of the Grinding Ground campaign that would eventually push Axis forces entirely off the continent. The B-17 Flying Fortress was, at that point in the war, the principal instrument of American strategic bombing. It was a remarkable aircraft by the standards of its era. 4 engines, 10 men, bristling with defensive machine guns in positions covering most of the aircraft's approach angles, designed specifically to fly in large formations that created overlapping fields of fire, making individual aircraft attacks by enemy fighters dangerous and difficult. It was also, like any aircraft, a machine built to function within specific structural tolerances. Those tolerances were generous. The B-17's reputation for absorbing battle damage and continuing to fly was already becoming legendary among the crews who flew it. But there were limits. There were always limits. February 1st would test what those limits actually were. The mission that day was a bombing run over Tunisia. The formation of B-17's took off from their North African base in the early morning, climbing into the desert sky in the careful sequence that heavy bomber formations required, aircraft slotting into position relative to each other with the precision that both formation integrity and collective self-defense demanded. Lieutenant Kendrick Bragg was at the controls of the B-17F, designated the All-American. She was a veteran aircraft by this point in the war, an aircraft that had flown enough missions that her crew had developed the specific relationship with a particular machine that combat air crews form when they have survived enough together to trust the aircraft beneath them with a specificity that goes beyond the general trust they place in the type. The crew that morning consisted of 10 men whose roles distributed them throughout the aircraft's length: pilots in the nose, bombardier and navigator forward, gunners at various stations through the midsection and rear, tail gunner isolated in the very back of the fuselage in a position that was, by the geometry of the aircraft, effectively separate from the rest of the crew in terms of physical access. They flew toward their target. The Luftwaffe and the Regia Aeronautica, the German and Italian air forces operating in North Africa, did not allow American bomber formations to reach their targets without response. German fighter pilots, primarily flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s, had developed tactics against American bomber formations that balanced the defensive firepower those formations could generate with the vulnerabilities that still existed in any bomber's protection, regardless of how many guns it carried. The attack came. What happened in the airspace over Tunisia on the morning of February 1st, 1943, happened fast, the way everything happens in aerial combat, in fractions of seconds, and at closure speeds that make the sequence of events almost impossible to reconstruct cleanly from survivor memory alone. A German Bf-109 fighter, either already hit by defensive fire from the formation or committing to an attack run that took it directly through the bomber stream, collided with the rear section of the All-American. Not a grazing contact, not a near miss that damaged both aircraft with shrapnel and prop wash. A direct structural collision. The Bf-109 tore through the rear fuselage of the B-17 at a speed and angle that the physics of the impact translated almost entirely into structural destruction of the bomber rather than the fighter. The fighter's momentum carrying it through and past the collision point, while the All-American's fuselage absorbed what that momentum produced. The damage was something that experienced pilots and ground crew, looking at what remained afterward, struggled to describe in language that conveyed both its extent and the fact that the aircraft was still in one piece. The rear fuselage of a B-17 Flying Fortress is the structural section that connects the wing assembly and midsection to the tail, the horizontal stabilizers, the vertical stabilizer, the entire aft control surface assembly that a pilot uses to maintain pitch and directional stability in flight. The collision had cut through that section as thoroughly as an incomplete amputation cuts through a limb. Framing members were severed, skin panels were torn away. The structural continuity that normally existed between the forward three-quarters of the aircraft and the rear quarter was reduced in the aftermath of the impact to what engineers examining the photographs later estimated as approximately one-third of the original structural cross-section. The tail of the All-American was connected to the rest of the aircraft by what remained. What remained, by any reasonable assessment, was not enough. In the forward sections of the aircraft, cockpit, navigator's station, bombardier's position, the waist gun positions, the men who had survived the initial impact understood something had happened. The aircraft had shuddered with a violence that went beyond anything flak or a near miss produced. Warning lights that had no business being illuminated were illuminated. Lieutenant Bragg and his co-pilot assessed the controls. The aircraft was responding, not cleanly. The control inputs required to maintain level flight and heading had changed in ways that told experienced pilots something significant had happened to the aircraft's aft section, but she was responding. She was still flying. The tail gunner's station was located in the very rear of the fuselage, a position so far aft and so structurally isolated that a man stationed there was, in the most immediate physical sense, on the other side of the damage from the rest of his crew. He was alive. The impact had not destroyed his position, but the structural damage between him and the rest of the aircraft had created a gap, a physical discontinuity in the fuselage that meant he could not simply walk forward through the interior of the aircraft the way any crew member might normally move through the B-17's tube-shaped interior. He was, in the most literal possible sense, separated from his crewmates by what the collision had done to the aircraft. They could communicate. They could not reach him. The other aircraft in the formation could see what had happened. This is one of the elements of the All-American story that most accounts struggle to convey with the impact it deserves, because it requires understanding what it looked like from outside the aircraft rather than from inside it. From the B-17's flying in formation around the All-American, the damage was fully visible. The missing and distorted fuselage sections, the tail that was clearly attached by less than it should have been, the gap in the rear fuselage through which open sky was visible where aircraft skin panels and framing should have been. Other crews watched her. Some of the accounts from men in those accompanying aircraft describe the experience of watching the All-American continue to fly in formation as something that fell outside the available vocabulary of what aircraft did. The plane should have come apart. The physics of what was happening, the aerodynamic forces operating on a tail section that was barely structurally connected to the aircraft it was theoretically part of, should have been producing a breakup. She stayed together. The tail section flexed. The damage visible from outside the aircraft moved. The partially severed rear fuselage was not rigidly fixed in place, and the flexing visible in photographs taken during the flight home shows that the structural connection holding it on was dynamic rather than static, giving and taking with the aerodynamic forces rather than rigidly resisting them. She stayed together. The pilots of the escorting aircraft flew alongside, not because there was anything they could do. There was nothing any crew in any other aircraft could do to help the All-American, but because the men flying those aircraft apparently found it impossible to simply turn away and leave a crew behind who were still, improbably, in the air. Lieutenant Bragg made his assessments with the information available to him. The aircraft was flying, the engines were functioning, the controls were responding, imperfectly but usefully. The tail gunner was alive and communicating. The mathematics of their situation were straightforward and offered no comfortable answers. They were approximately 70 miles from their base. 70 miles in a B-17 operating at mission altitude and speed is a relatively brief period of flight.